Hey Budget Gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I answer some of your early fall gardening questions. So let's go. It is about time. We have been in such a drought here in New Hampshire. We finally have a nice rainy day. It's a great day for me to be tucked inside my shed, potting up some plants and answering some of your questions. I have a plant nursery on my property and I use it for two purposes. One of them is it's a place for me to put plants where I want to have them in my garden, but I don't know where I want to put them in the garden yet. So it's basically a temporary holding spot for some of my plants that are going to get planted out in the future. But I also have a plant nursery where I sell plants to people locally. I don't ship the plants out, but I just put a listing out on Facebook Marketplace and I've met a lot of nice people that way. And it's a great way for me to offer plants locally. I'm going to be potting up my plants in this mixture here. It's a combination of some compost that I have, some used potting mix, and then some topsoil. I just have some used pots that I get from a local garden center, and then I have some plants that I recently dug up. In fact, some of them we dug up together from a pond that I have out in my front yard. So I'm going to get started with the questions, but I just wanted to explain what's going on over here while I'm talking. And before I forget, I wanted to thank you if you submitted your questions to me. Oftentimes I'll put something out on YouTube posts, which is like a community space, asking for any questions that you might have. And then I like to make a video just to answer those questions. The first question comes from Nancy Gibney. She asks, can I plant new daylily plants now or wait until spring? Also, have you had any luck with coneflower seeds coming up? Thank you. I love your podcast. Thanks, Nancy. I appreciate your sweet comment as well as your questions. When it comes to planting out perennials in the landscape, fall is a great time to be doing this. Although there is a certain period of time in the fall, especially if you live in a colder climate like I do here in New Hampshire, Zone 5B, where it's getting too late and getting too close where you don't want to be planting perennials in your landscape. And it's based on when the ground freezes, if the ground freezes where you live. So where I live, absolutely the ground does freeze, and it freezes for a long period of time. So what you want to do is you want to get your plants in many weeks before the ground freezes. That way the plants have enough time for their roots to establish themselves. Now, of course, when is that, right? When does the ground freeze where you live? You can always look on the internet and see if you can find that information. I think in New Hampshire, Zone 5B, where I live, I think the ground freezes probably in November. But again, I think it's best to do a little bit of research on that. Normally, I don't like to cut it close though. So for me, I really should stop planting things in the ground, I would say early to mid-October. But of course, there are places in the world where the ground never freezes. So in those situations, anyone living there can plant all year long. And then Nancy, your next question was whether or not I had luck with coneflower seeds coming up. I've had a lot of luck with coneflower seeds coming up. In fact, sometimes it can be a little overwhelming, to be honest with you, with how many coneflower seeds come up each year. I do like to leave certain plants up during the season because I want to make sure that I have food for the wildlife. But on the negative side of all of that, sometimes you end up with lots of little seedlings everywhere. That can be a plus because now you have free plants in your yard. But then on the flip side, you might end up with hundreds of seedlings, and sometimes it can be a little too much when it comes to pricking each one out and moving them around your yard. Now, one reason why someone might not see as many plants seeding themselves around like coneflower could be that they have a very thick layer of mulch or wood chips down. And if that's the case, then it would be hard for those little seeds to germinate. The next question comes from Lisa Smith, and she asks, what is the sun meter you use and are you happy with it? So I have talked about this tool a number of times in my videos, and it's something that is new to me for the year, so I can talk a little bit about it because I have a little bit of experience under my belt with this tool. But before I tell you about it, let me tell you a little history about it. I have never fully known about my different flower beds and whether they are full sun, part shade, or full shade. To be honest with you, for many years, if I just looked at a flower bed and I saw that it was getting a handful of hours of sun a day, I just automatically assumed, okay, well, that's a sunny flower bed, or that's a full sun flower bed. And, you know, we learn this over time that that's not necessarily true. It's very important to know what kind of sunlight a flower bed is getting. Is it getting morning sun when the sun is just coming up and maybe it's not at the highest point, so it's not the strongest? or is it getting afternoon sun where the sun is definitely stronger? And then how many hours of sun is that flower bed getting a day? Now, if I just had one small little patch in my yard and I just sat there during the summertime, because that's the best time to monitor our flower beds is during the summer, and if I was just watching it morning to evening, then I could probably get a good sense or a good feeling. But because I have so many different flower beds in lots of different areas of my yard, it was just too much work. So I figured there must be a tool out there. Someone must have invented a way, like a tracker, to track the sun. And I did find something on Amazon. And when I was researching it, to be honest with you, I didn't find a lot of tools out there that do that. So I was a little worried. I was a little skeptical on what I would think of this tool. And what I'll do, Lisa, is I'll put a link to that tool down below. I'm going to pop it up on the screen also, but I'll put a link to it down below in my Amazon storefront. Speaking of the Amazon storefront, a number of you have reached out to me asking me to create a storefront because you'd like to buy the same products I have. And you've mentioned that you want to help support me in some way, which I really am grateful and thankful for. So I've just barely set it up and I'm still working on it. But I'll put a link to that storefront as well down below in case you want to check out what's in there. So to answer the question on whether or not I'm happy with that tool, I definitely am. I'll share one thing that I'm not happy about, but it has to do with something I did wrong. So the way the tool works is that you want to place it outside like early in the morning when the sun's coming up, which here during the summertime in New Hampshire is usually 7 a.m. And then you want to keep it out for about 12 hours. So about 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. is how long I kept it out for. Now, keep in mind, I'm not doing it anymore because our days are getting shorter. And then it's going to be winter time and our days will be very short. So there's no use in me tracking my flower beds at this time of year. Although if you live in a warmer climate, you could definitely still do that. But for my purposes, I'm only going to be using it in the summertime, and I'm going to use it during the longest days of my summer. So for about a 12-hour window. And I will share that I actually created a document on Google Drive to also keep track of everything because I don't know about you guys, but I forget stuff. So if I put this tool every single day in a different area of my gardens, I wouldn't remember which beds were part sun, which ones were full sun. So every day after 12 hours was done, I just made a note in my document on Google Drive, just so I can reference it in the future. But it has been awesome. It has told me if a bed that I thought was part sun was actually full sun, or if I thought a bed was full sun was actually part shade. Trust me, it's not that easy sometimes when you see sun coming in a flower bed. You just assume it must be a sunny area and that you could put full sun flowers in there. And sometimes you can get away with that. Sometimes you can put something, like I have a flower bed that's considered part shade, I found out this year, even though it gets sun there and quite a bit of it. I have daylilies that bloom in that bed, and I also have echinacea that bloom in that bed. There are some perennials that will bloom in a part shade situation. They just won't bloom as nicely as they would in a full sun situation. And oftentimes, they might even be reaching for the sun if they're in an area where they're surrounded by some woods on one side, which is the case about this flower bed that I'm talking about. So near the end of summer, I did break the tool, and I'm blaming myself. I left it out overnight, and then we had some rain, quite a bit of rain, and I think I short-circuited it. So I don't believe it's waterproof based on the fact that that just happened once in one day and then it was broken. But it was cheap enough that I was able to replace it again, and I did buy a new one. So I would recommend that you do it on a sunny day where it's going to be sunny all day long, because that's when it's going to work anyways, in the sun. And then also just bring it in at night. Don't leave it outside overnight just in case you're going to get rain. But I would absolutely recommend that tool, which is why I put it in my Amazon storefront, because I really like it, and it is helping me immensely to understand the sun situation in all my different areas of my bed. And I'm not just using it in flower beds. I'm also using it in like my raised vegetable garden, which is in my backyard. I've been using it in some of my hanging baskets or my window boxes, where I'm not quite sure what the sun situation is with some of my window boxes. So be creative with it if you do end up buying it. You don't have to just use it in a garden space. You can also use it in a container pot that you have placed somewhere in your garden. The next question is from Asteria, and she asks, do you do a fall push in your backyard nursery for perennials, etc.? So Asteria is asking about when I make my sales as part of my backyard plant nursery and where I put my listing on Facebook Marketplace, which, by the way, this is my third year of selling plants from my property as part of my nursery, and it's been such a cool experience. I would say in early September, I dropped the prices a little bit for my plants in my nursery because at least here, that's when things are starting to slow down. The weather is starting to cool down too, which is a good thing because it's time to plant perennials in the landscape. So I figured it's a nice time for me to drop the prices just for the fall time. And then in the spring, the prices go back up, which is no different than any garden center. And I will share that there aren't a ton of people that are looking for plants this time of year where I live, which that might surprise a lot of you. You might be like, wait a minute, what? This is the time of year to be looking for those sales, those bargains. Well, we're bargain hunters, and my channel is all about gardening on a budget. So I would be the first one looking on Facebook Marketplace. And if I saw someone was selling plants and they had marked down their prices, I would definitely be going to their nursery. But not everyone thinks that way or feels that way. They would rather kind of be like, okay, summer is ending and come spring, I'll go shopping again. So I continue to sell my plants through the month of September. But after that, I just pull down my ad because there's really no use in trying to sell plants. In fact, I don't want to be selling plants because I don't want people to think it's okay to put those plants in their landscape. They're taking a chance that the plants may not winter over. I would rather them not even take that chance. So September is my month for doing that last push of sales. In fact, I did have someone come and buy some plants today, but I anticipate there aren't really going to be many more sales from here on out until springtime. In case anyone's wondering what are the plants that I'm potting up, one of them is called a dwarf lady's mantle, which I dug up from around my pond out front. And then the other plant is called great blue lobelia. And the great blue lobelia were just little seedlings that were also around my pond. The next question comes from John Wood. So I saved some peach pits to try and start in January. Space being an issue. Have 8-inch pots, thinking 2 or 3 pits in each pot and then transplanting. When, if they start and get big enough, do you think that will work? So John, even though I don't have much experience or any experience actually with what you're trying to do, I think it's a great experiment and it's worth trying. And I like the idea that you're waiting until January to plant those peach pits because you want to make sure you're not planting them too soon. Since you live in an area that's quite cold, just like I live in an area that's quite cold, there's no use in starting them until a little bit later. And I also like the idea that you're putting 2 or 3 pits in each pot so that they basically, if only one takes, then that's great. And if all 3 take, you can always divide them up. But you'll have to keep me posted, John. I want to know what ends up happening now because I'm curious. I just think that it's a neat experiment that you're trying. So I wish I had more information for you, but like I said, I just don't have any experience, so I don't want to lead you the wrong way. But I think you're on the right track. The next question comes from Gwen, and she asks, when do you decide to empty your impatient plants? Mine are doing great with a ton of color, but nights here are getting really cold. Gwen, you and I are in the same exact boat, my friend. Our nights are getting cold as well. In fact, this time of year can be very tricky. Tomorrow it's supposed to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and later next week it's supposed to be 32 degrees Fahrenheit at nighttime. And when you think about it, that's a huge shift in terms of temperature, right? And when I look around my yard, I would say the number one thing that's giving a lot of color and still looking great would be my impatiens. So for me, I still want to keep babying my impatiens for as long as I can. I've stopped fertilizing them at this point. They still look great. I'm giving them a lot of water because they need water every single day. And my hope is that night that it gets 32 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm hoping to go around and bring all my container pots, my hanging baskets, window boxes. I don't even know how many there are. There must be at least 20 of them. And just bring them in for shelter in my garage or my barn. But normally I do prefer to wait. If there's an annual that's looking really good still, I prefer to wait until the annual is not looking good anymore. And when it comes to the impatiens, since they still look good, I would keep them out in the landscape for as long as possible, up until a frost hits them. And what you had mentioned along with your question, Gwen, was Mine are doing great with a ton of color, but nights here are getting really cold. So Gwen, if you're due for a number of nights of a frost, then it makes sense to go ahead and just get rid of your impatiens at this point. But if you only have one night of a frost, but still many nights that are in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range, and the impatiens are still looking good, then you might just want to ask yourself, is it worth trying to bring in for the night and then bring back out during the day? That's what I'm going to do. But if it's not worth it, then go ahead and just dump them out, and there's always next year. But don't forget to collect the seeds if you haven't already, because this winter I want a lot of us together to be growing our impatiens from seed. We can save so much money that way. And if you didn't collect any seeds, it's okay. You can always buy some impatiens seeds. But I would love to see you grow your own impatiens from seed if you haven't already. It's a lot of fun. So then I heard from Charles Plummer. The question is, have you ever tried growing peony from seed? I never have. I think it would be fun. There are certain plants that take a long time to grow from a seed. And I don't know how long it takes for a peony to grow from seed to bloom. It might be 2 or 3 years, I'm not quite sure. But I think it's worth trying if you were able to collect your own peony seeds. I have quite a few peonies in my landscape, so when it comes to propagating them, it's a lot easier for me to just divide them. But I will say that if I ever saw a peony somewhere, let's say it was in someone else's garden, and their peony was beautiful, and I didn't have that peony in my yard and I wanted it, but I didn't want to ask them to divide their plant for me, then I would definitely ask them to save a seed or a couple of seeds off their plant for me. Now, I'm not quite sure when it comes to peonies, whether or not if you start a peony from seed, if it will come true to the parent plant. But sometimes it doesn't matter. Even if it didn't come true, it's not going to be some odd looking, weird looking peony. I'm sure it would be something beautiful. And if I was to grow a peony from seed, because it's a perennial, I would use the winter sowing process so that the seed gets an automatic cold stratification period. I don't know if peony seeds need a cold stratification period, and if they do, I don't know how long of a cold stratification period they need. But nevertheless, if I did winter sowing, then those seeds would automatically get that cold period. So I say if you do have some peony seeds, go ahead and sow them and see what happens. Charles also asks, given the drought conditions, how has it impacted your fall gardening overall? Or is drip irrigation used in all garden beds? So the drip irrigation that I have, I got the irrigation installed in my lawn as well as some of my garden beds about 10 years ago. And then I would say maybe 2 years ago, we had the irrigation company come back out and just set up extra zones for us, but that was it. And then my husband and I slowly have been adding drip to a number of garden beds around our property, basically where the lawn ends and where the woods begin. And we're definitely not done with that project. We're tackling it one garden bed at a time as we work on new garden beds. So even though I do have drip irrigation installed in a number of areas, and that has really saved me a lot of time when it comes to watering a lot of my gardens because it just runs on a daily basis, I don't have drip irrigation set up on every single thing that I have in my garden. So for example, a majority of my hanging baskets, window boxes, and container pots, not all of them, but most of them are not on drip irrigation. So those need to be hand watered once, if not twice a day. Although at this time of year, they don't need as much water, but definitely during our summer, because it was so dry and so hot, either myself or my husband, we were out there all the time watering those container pots. And even though we have drip irrigation in a lot of our flower beds, there are certain areas within the flower bed where the water just doesn't reach every single plant. So even in those cases, I saw that some of the plants were suffering a little bit. It was definitely a tough year, but I'm thankful that many of my plants are set up on irrigation. So time will tell. I'm not sure if I lost anything. I will say that there were some small leaf rhododendrons that I planted during the late spring. And even though initially I was really good about hand watering them, those plus some other shrubs that I moved around my yard, I'm not sure if they're going to survive, to be honest with you. In hindsight, I'm kind of kicking myself. I really should have at least put some sort of an emitter going straight to each of those shrubs when I moved them. But that's how we learn, right? So yes, it was a tough year with irrigating plants, and hopefully I didn't have too many losses. We'll find out next year. The next question comes from Elizabeth Bautista, and she asks, when should I start Gerbera seeds zone 9? So Elizabeth, I grew Gerbera plants from seed that I collected a number of years ago, and it's been a long time. What I'll do is I'm going to look it up and I'll pop it up on the screen for you, because I don't remember off the top of my head when to start Gerbera seeds, but I remember it being pretty early on. And where you live in zone 9, you may be able to get that plant to come back year after year for you. I'm not quite sure. I remember when I stored the seeds, I stored them in the refrigerator. And then when I planted the seeds, it was not the easiest plant to grow from seed. I remember that. And I was thrilled when I saw that the seeds actually germinated. And my experience anyway was when I did finally get blooms on the plants, the blooms weren't as showy or as nice as I was hoping for, which is why I never did it again other than that 1 year. But it could be just because I was using seeds that I collected myself. If anyone else out there that's watching this has ever started Gerbera daisies from seed, please chime in and let me know what your experience was. And did you use seeds that you bought or seeds that you collected? But Elizabeth, I hope you have better luck than I did when it comes to the Gerbera daisy. I think everyone should try to grow Gerbera daisy from seed at least once. It's worth the effort. The next question comes from Gilda Martinez. Gilda asks, when do we stop watering our garden plants? First frost? That, I think, is probably one of the most popular questions out there in the gardening world, is when do we stop watering our plants? So it's a great question. And I think it's going to depend on a lot of different factors. The first factor is, where do you live? And what kind of weather are you getting? So where I live, we haven't had any freezing temperatures yet, but it's been extremely dry except for today. So even though it's later in the season and the plants are slowing down, I am still watering a lot of my potted annuals on a daily basis. However, when it comes to my perennials and the drip irrigation that I have, as well as my lawn, I have really pulled things back quite a bit. And I used to water everything that was on drip every day. And now I'm only watering things every other day. Although I could have changed it. I could have done it so that each zone runs daily, but runs for a shorter period of time than what it was running during the summertime. And I adopted a spot where I take care of some other flowers 30 minutes away from my house. And that's also set up on drip irrigation. I did the same thing. I am not watering that area nearly as much as I was during the hot summer months. But if you live somewhere where it's still very hot, because some areas are still getting temperatures that are like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then you want to be watering your plants much more often than I am. So I would say, if the temperatures are starting to cool down, and if you're getting a lot of moisture where you live, then you probably don't need to be watering as much. And when it comes to the perennials, there is that certain point, like where I live, that the perennials are ready to go to sleep. They're ready to go dormant, which is a huge reason why I've pulled back on the watering in all of my perennial beds. Because sometimes too much water is not a good thing. I don't want to rot out my plants either, especially as the temperatures start to cool down. So there's no exact answer for every single person that's watching this video. I would just say that look at your temperatures, look at your weather, and if the temperatures are cooling down and if you're getting moisture, then your plants don't need as much water. And in terms of when to stop watering all the plants in your garden altogether, again, some of us get a frost. Some people like hardly ever get a frost the whole entire year. So I can't just say stop watering as soon as you get your first frost, because some areas will never ever see a frost. And I will share, I just got a notice actually today from the irrigation company stating that the time has come to winterize the irrigation system. So that tells me that it's time to turn off irrigation pretty soon. And that's especially true here where I live in New Hampshire. The next question comes from Suzanne Beck, and Suzanne asks, when do you start to heal your plants in your nursery? So if any of you are not familiar with that term, healing in is basically temporarily protecting a plant during the winter months and protecting it in a way so that you're protecting the roots of a potted plant. Now, I've had plants that were in pots that I bought at the end of the season on clearance that were in big, huge pots. I did nothing to them. They stayed outside in the elements, snow, rain, ice, freezing cold temperatures, and they survive just fine. But when you have a small pot like this, and I have many, like hundreds of pots that are this size that are in my plant nursery, there's less soil in here. There is a much higher likelihood that a plant this size will not overwinter and live for me come next spring, given how much cold we get here. It would just freeze solid. All those roots are exposed on all corners. So what I end up doing is I end up healing the plants in, which is digging a trench. And the trench can be anywhere. It can be in a raised garden bed. It can be out directly inside of one of my flower beds, or it can be in an area that's designated, which for me is my plant nursery. I basically dig up a trench that's about as deep as this pot here, and then I huddle a whole bunch of pots next to each other in that trench, and then I pull back the soil so that basically only the top part of the pot is exposed, but all the sides of it are protected. So in a way, it's like I took the plant and I planted it in the ground, but I actually took the pot and planted it in the ground. So I've already started healing plants in because it's a very tedious process. It takes a long time. In fact, what I'm doing right now with the potting up of these plants, eventually all these plants are going to get healed in as well. Should I have started the process maybe a month ago? Yeah, I definitely should have. But this time of year, it's just so hard to focus because there's so many different things going on in the garden. So I really should have started this process probably a month or two ago. But it's okay, as long as I get all my plants healed into the ground before the ground freezes, I'll be fine. And I want to make sure that I'm done potting up plants well before the ground freezes, because again, I want these plants to have their roots established inside of each of these pots. So if anyone wants to do the same thing, and you don't have to have a plant nursery to heal a plant in, you might have bought something on clearance, you might have dug something up in your landscape and you don't know where you want to put it, and you don't want to lose your plant. I would recommend trying to heal the plant in. And as long as you do it before the ground freezes, you should be fine. Suzanne also asks, do you cut the plants you are healing in, or do you let them stand throughout the winter? I try to treat them very similar to plants that I have out in my landscape. So for example, hosta. Hosta plants really should be cut back, because otherwise, if you don't cut them back, that's just a great little home for insects that are not good, like slugs, to overwinter in. So I definitely cut back all the hosta leaves in my plant nursery. The same is true for my daylilies and my peonies. Any plants that are known to either have disease or issues with the wrong type of insects overwintering, those are the ones I like to cut back. I also have bee balm in my nursery, and the bee balm has powdery mildew. I'll be cutting all that back as well. But otherwise, many of the other plants, I don't cut them back. I just leave them as is. It really depends on how much time I have. If I have time, I would prefer to cut them back because it's one less chore to do in the springtime. And if I don't have time, I'm just going to leave them as is. So some examples would be obedient plant, my penstemon, even my iris, although I would like to cut back my iris as well. So it just depends on how much time I have. But I'm definitely going to start with the plants that I know I have to cut back because of issues with powdery mildew or issues with those slugs. And those are the plants that I already mentioned earlier. The next question comes from ILNPA. Hello, Vita. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. I have two questions. One, how to care for cuttings overwintering. That question will depend on where you live. If it's me that's trying to overwinter cuttings, I definitely would not try to overwinter my cuttings outdoors because of the elements in the wintertime. It's just too cold and I wouldn't want to lose my cuttings. But if you live in a much warmer climate, in a higher zone, then you may be able to overwinter your cuttings just fine outside. So the colder that you live, where it's much colder, then you want to protect those cuttings and you want to bring them in, either into your unheated basement, your unheated garage. It could even be maybe a shed or a barn, but you just don't want them to be out in the elements, especially if you're going to get snow and ice like what we get here. But if you live somewhere where it doesn't get as cold, you might be okay with leaving it outside. And then the next question is, how often should you water plants in winter? So I basically answered that earlier, but if we're talking about anything that you're overwintering, like let's say cuttings or anything else that you're overwintering, you don't need to water those plants very often at all if you're overwintering a plant. And like I love to overwinter plants in my garage. I only water them maybe once a month. But if we're talking about plants that are out in our landscape, our ground freezes, and so I stop watering once the ground freezes because I get enough moisture from all the snow that we get here during the winter months. And to be honest with you, I can't really speak if someone lives in a much warmer area, how often do you water your plants during those winter months? I'm not quite sure. And I think a lot of it has to do with how much moisture you're getting, what are your temperatures, what kind of plant is it? But I think in general, if a plant goes dormant, meaning it drops all its leaves and it's asleep and it's dormant, usually plants like that don't need a lot of water. But if you have a plant in a pot or a container, like a perennial plant, and you're not getting enough moisture where you live, then you want to make sure you're still giving that potted plant some water, but don't give it too much water if it's winter time, because again, if the plant is dormant, you don't want to rot the roots. So I don't have a lot of experience with basically watering plants during the winter months and those warmer climates. But I would also do a little research on the internet if you do live somewhere where it's warmer, or someone else can chime in and talk about where they live, what zone they live in, and how do they handle their potted and not potted plants during the winter months. The next question comes from Nancy Youngs, and she asks, do you amend your soil? I amended almost all my flower beds over the last 5 years, and I amended them using a mixture of things. The number one thing I've used is my own homemade compost, and I'll be showing you all in probably the next month my process for composting, although I do have a lot of videos that go over that, and I can link those down below in case you've missed them. I love fall. I love all the free leaves that I get, and I definitely use those leaves in my garden. So I love to amend my beds with that compost that I make, and I've done it over the last many years. So the beds are in pretty good shape, but that doesn't mean the job is done. I still need to be applying compost frequently in order to keep feeding the soil. I will say that I've added some bark mulch to my flower beds, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for me to amend my flower beds with my compost. I would have to pull back the mulch, put a little bit side dressing of the compost around each individual perennial, and then put the mulch back, and it's a lot of work. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. Another option is just to add the compost layer on top of my bark mulch, but then I'd have to add bark mulch again next year. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do when it comes to that. But at least I do have a good layer of compost that has been applied in all my flower beds. So not just compost that I made, but I also had horse manure that I've put down, and it was horse manure that was not fresh. It was already aged horse manure. The only problem with horse manure is that you will get a lot of weed seeds, and I found that out the hard way. And then I've also used leaves. I don't like to use big leaves because they mat down. I like to use a leaf shredder, and I like to shred the leaves up into small pieces, and then I like to put that as kind of a mulch over some of my beds. But on the flip side, the bad thing is it can also harbor unnecessary pests and insects. So you want to be a little more careful if you're going to do that. And even though I've been gardening for a long time, I used to think that once you have amended your flower beds with compost, that your job is done, that you have fed your soil and it's going to automatically keep feeding itself, and that you have made it so that it's a nice, well-draining soil, and when you pick it up, it feels good to the touch. That's not necessarily it, though. I learned that you have to keep continuously be adding compost to your flower beds so that the microbes and all the little insects and everything that lives in there, so that they continuously can keep eating good stuff. You're basically feeding them. You want to make sure you continue feeding the soil. And that's another reason why you'll see sometimes people will just chop and drop their green material when they're cleaning up their flower beds. That's one way to compost in place. Or when you're cutting back your annuals, that you're not pulling the annuals out, but you're just cutting them at the base. I try to do that so that the roots compost in place as well. Nancy also asks, if you have a bare patch of soil, do you cover it in the winter with compost or leaf mold? And that's a great question. I have read and I've heard a lot about using cover crops, be it in the vegetable garden or in raised beds, or even in our garden beds where we have flowers. And I've never actually used any sort of a cover crop. I just have my mulch that's down, And then in previous years, there were times when I shredded up the leaves and I put that down as a layer. So it just depends on the year and what I have time for. But otherwise, generally, I don't do anything to cover up any bare spots around my garden. But I do hear that it is better for you to do that during the winter months. The next question is from Peggy M. And Peggy says, "Hi Vita, I hope all is well and that your garden continues growing healthy and strong." Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate it. My question is in reference to planting beds under trees, mostly oaks, maples, and poplar trees. My hosta, coral bells, lorope all do well, but not all plants thrive in this area. I know they are competing with trees for nutrients, but I was hoping I might be able to improve the conditions to make it a good planting area for more adaptable plants. I amended the soil and I fertilized during the growing season. Thank you. Well, you're definitely on the right track, Peggy, because growing under trees is tricky. And I know it firsthand because a lot of my garden beds are where the lawn ends and where the woods begin. So many of the plants are competing with the trees that are in that area. And you're definitely right in amending the soil. You know, you want to add as much organic material as you can just to enrich that soil and make it a nice place for those plants to want to live. After all, those plants are competing with the roots of all those trees. And I think some of the plants that you listed are definitely good options for plants to grow in those tough situations. And I think fertilizing the plants definitely helps as well. But the biggest thing is just making sure you're researching plants that thrive in dry shade and making sure that those plants are still getting water. They don't need a ton of water, but they do need some water, especially as they're establishing themselves. And don't plant them too close to the base of the tree, and you should be okay. And Peggy, I don't know if you've seen any of my garden tours, and if not, definitely check out my latest garden tour. But I have an area in my backyard right next to what I call the hosta garden. And I think that that's a dry shade area. I mean, I do have it set up on drip irrigation, but nevertheless, a lot of the plants that I've put in that area are perfect for a situation like you're talking about. I know one plant that does really well under there, although it can be a little pricey, is hellebore. But if you buy one hellebore plant, you can divide it each year. Recoup some of your money. That's what I've done when I think I bought 2 hellebore plants before. Now I have maybe 10 or 12. I'm planning on adding some big root geranium or macrorrhizum. Those seem to do really well in a situation like that. If you don't have it, I suggest barrenwort or epimedium. I also have that plant in that dry shade location, and it does really well in that situation. Another plant that you can try is foam flower or tiarella. There are some that are native and some that are non-native, and I have that in that area as well, and it looks so pretty. It adds a nice pop of color, and it does well in that situation. And then try wild ginger. There is the Canadian wild ginger and then the European wild ginger. One is native and one is not, depending on where you live. But I have the European wild ginger, and it is so pretty. Now, I don't have it out in that area that I'm telling you about. I have it in a different area of my yard, but I'm definitely going to be adding some to this dry shade area of my garden. Now, you might want to even try some ground covers. The perennial geranium that I mentioned, that's sometimes can be treated as a ground cover. But another one that you can try would be Pachysandra, although it can get a little bit invasive. So I'm going to caution you with that. Another ground cover that you could try in dry shade would be sweet woodruff. And then there are so many different types of sedges that you can try. So research the sedges and see if there's another one that you like that you would want to add to that space. And then of course, ferns. We can't forget about ferns. In that dry shade area of my garden, I have Japanese painted fern, and it looks so pretty there. I also have a maidenhair fern that's really thriving. And those are just some examples. There are so many different kinds of ferns out there. So the fact that you have added organic material and you're going to continue adding organic material is a plus, but don't forget to add the moisture. You might need to add drip irrigation or a soaker hose, or at a minimum, just make sure you're hand watering it frequently because it will be dry under there. And it's just, especially if there's a drought, you want to make sure that you're just supplementing a little bit of water. And you could always add mulch to help retain the water. You could add a layer of wood chips, which you can get for free. You could buy some bark mulch, or you could just put an extra layer of compost on top. And those ground covers that I mentioned earlier, those also can act in a way that they're protecting the ground a little bit and helping retain the water. we made a good dent in putting these up. I'm going to keep on putting them up, but I wanted to thank you all for your wonderful questions. And also, I want to thank you for your support. A few of you have written me letting me know that you've been hyping my videos. I really don't even understand this whole hype business and what it means, but I know that it helps my channel out. And so I want to thank you for hyping any videos that you've been hyping. And as you watch any of my videos and you hit the thumbs up or the like button, that just tells YouTube to keep pushing the video out to other people. And that helps not only me out, but then it also helps other people that haven't found my channel. So I really appreciate that. I really enjoyed making these videos for you. I love just bringing you along in my garden and talking through the process of what I'm doing and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And as always, if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to drop it in this video or any other video that I make. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.